Arthur Morgan is often viewed as a man seeking redemption. But if you look closer at his life, his morals weren't something that developed late. They were coping mechanisms, shaped by years of instability inside the van der Linde gang. Arthur's entire worldview comes from being raised in an environment where loyalty wasn't just encouraged, it was the currency of survival. When Dutch found Arthur as a teenager after his mother died and his father was killed by outlaws, Arthur didn't just become a gang member, he became someone who believed that the gang was the only structure in a chaotic world. That's why throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur's moral choices are often less about righteousness and more about instinct. He's not naturally violent for the sake of violence. He's violent because that's all he was ever taught to do when confronted with threats. Even the most brutal missions he carries out early in the game aren't done with joy. They're done with a kind of weary obligation, as if Arthur's telling himself the only way to keep the people he cares about safe is to follow Dutch's orders without question. But what's fascinating is that Arthur's moral awakening doesn't begin with Dutch or even with the gang falling apart. It begins years earlier with the people he quietly formed bonds with behind the scenes. Characters like Mary Beth, Jack, and even Tilly influence Arthur more than he ever admits. These aren't relationships built on crime. They're built on trust, something he rarely experienced growing up. That's why when the gang starts fracturing, Arthur doesn't suddenly change. He finally has permission to listen to the part of himself he had been suppressing for years. The turning point, though, is his tuberculosis diagnosis. People often say the diagnosis forces Arthur to reflect, but it actually does something more profound. It removes the illusion that following Dutch will secure his future. For the first time in his life, Arthur sees that the man he built his identity around is not a leader, not a protector, but someone who manipulates loyalty for personal ego. And once Arthur recognizes that, he starts developing his own moral compass, one that isn't filtered through Dutch's expectations. What makes Arthur's transformation so powerful is that it isn't based on hope. He doesn't think he's going to survive long enough to fix everything. Instead, he becomes determined to make sure the next generation doesn't inherit the same broken system he grew up in. That's why his dedication to John and Abigail becomes so intense near the end. Arthur realizes that the best thing he can do with the time he has left is break the cycle of violence that shaped him. Even the small acts of kindness players can perform. Helping strangers, returning lost items, stopping ambushes, aren't just gameplay choices. They show the potential Arthur always had, but was never allowed to explore under Dutch's control. And that's the real tragedy of Arthur Morgan. He was capable of being a genuinely good man long before his final days, but the life he was forced into never gave him the chance. When he dies on that mountain, depending on the player's honor, Arthur's last expression says everything. If his honor is high, he accepts peace, not because he thinks he deserves it, but because he finally understands that someone like him can still leave something meaningful behind. And if his honor is low, his final breaths become bitter, angry, filled with regret. Because deep down, he knows he never let himself be the man he could have been. Arthur's story isn't just about redemption,